March 9, 1974. Lubang Island, Philippines. A 52-year-old man in a tattered Imperial Japanese Army uniform emerges from the jungle. He is carrying a functioning rifle. His sword is still sharp. He has been waiting for orders. The orders come from Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, who flew from Japan specifically to deliver them. The major reads from a prepared statement. Lieutenant Onoda, you are hereby relieved of all combat duties. The war ended 29 years ago. Japan surrendered. You are ordered to surrender your weapons and return to Japan. Hiroo Onoda salutes. He carefully lays down his rifle. He surrenders his sword. He has been fighting World War II since 1944. It is now 1974. Richard Nixon is President of the United States. The Vietnam War is ending. Japan is an economic superpower, and Hiroo Onoda has spent the last 3 decades hiding in the jungle, killing civilians, and refusing to believe the war is over. This is not a story about a soldier who did not know the war ended. Onoda knew. He received leaflets. His family came to find him. The Japanese government sent search parties. He ignored all of them. This is a story about what happens when obedience to orders becomes absolute, and the concept of surrender becomes impossible. The problem facing the Imperial Japanese Army in 1944 was not winning the war. By December 1944, Japan had lost control of the Pacific. American forces were island hopping toward the Japanese homeland. The Philippines were being recaptured. Japanese military leadership knew the war was lost, but the concept of surrender was incompatible with Japanese military culture. The Bushido Code taught that death was preferable to capture. Soldiers were expected to fight until killed, or until ordered to stop by superior officers. This created a doctrinal problem. If Japan surrendered, would soldiers accept it? Would they keep fighting? Japanese military leadership needed soldiers who would continue guerrilla operations even if Japan fell. They needed men who would never surrender regardless of circumstances. They selected soldiers for special guerrilla training. The training emphasized absolute obedience to orders and complete rejection of enemy propaganda. Hiroo Onoda was one of these soldiers. His training would work too well. Onoda's background was typical for Japanese soldiers of his generation. He was born in 1922 in Wakayama Prefecture. He was drafted into the Imperial Japanese Army in 1942 at age 20. He was assigned to an infantry unit in China. He distinguished himself as intelligent and dedicated. In 1944, he was selected for Nakano School, a special intelligence training facility. Nakano School taught guerrilla warfare, intelligence gathering, and propaganda resistance. The training was psychological. Instructors taught students that all enemy information was lies, that leaflets were propaganda, that surrender announcements were tricks, and that the only truth came from the Imperial Army chain of command. Students were taught to trust nothing except direct orders from their commanding officers. Onoda absorbed these lessons completely. In December 1944, he was promoted to lieutenant and sent to Lubang Island in the Philippines. His orders came directly from Major Yoshimi Taniguchi. The orders were clear: conduct guerrilla operations, gather intelligence, and under no circumstances surrender. You will be retrieved when the war is won. Wait for orders. Onoda took these orders literally. He would wait 29 years. Onoda's technique for survival was built on discipline and paranoia. When American forces liberated the Philippines in February 1945, Onoda and 3 other Japanese soldiers retreated into the jungle interior of Lubang Island. They established hidden camps, rationed supplies, avoided contact with civilians, and conducted reconnaissance of American positions. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Onoda did not believe it. American aircraft dropped leaflets announcing the surrender. Onoda concluded the leaflets were propaganda designed to trick Japanese soldiers into revealing themselves. His Nakano School training had prepared him for exactly this deception. In October 1945, a Japanese search party arrived on Lubang. They brought letters from Onoda's family. They brought newspapers showing Japan's surrender. They broadcast messages over loudspeakers. Onoda watched from hiding. He concluded this was an elaborate American trick using Japanese collaborators. His orders said wait for retrieval by the Imperial Army. This was not the Imperial Army. This was enemy deception. Onoda stayed hidden. Over the next 29 years, this pattern repeated. Philippine government officials came to the island. Onoda's brother came in 1952 with family photos and letters. Onoda's father came in 1959. They called his name through the jungle. They left packages of food and newspapers. Onoda concluded all of it was enemy intelligence operations. The newspapers showed Japan rebuilding. They showed economic growth and peace treaties. Onoda's Nakano training said enemy propaganda would use realistic details to seem credible. The more realistic the newspapers looked, the more convinced Onoda became they were sophisticated forgeries. His orders were clear. Trust nothing except direct orders from his commanding officer. Major Taniguchi had not come. Therefore, the war continued. Onoda would keep fighting. The specifications of what Onoda did during 29 years in hiding show both dedication and tragedy. He conducted guerrilla operations against what he believed was enemy occupation. He burned rice stores to deny resources to the enemy. He shot at Philippine civilians he believed were enemy collaborators or military personnel. Between 1945 and 1974, Onoda and his fellow holdouts killed approximately 30 Philippine civilians. They wounded many more. From Onoda's perspective, these were military actions against enemy forces. From the Philippine perspective, these were murders committed by Japanese soldiers who refused to accept the war had ended. The Philippine government sent police and military units to capture Onoda. He evaded them. His 3 companions died over the years. 1 surrendered in 1950. 2 were killed in firefights with Philippine forces in 1954 and 1972. By 1972, Onoda was alone. He continued his mission. The question everyone asked after Onoda's surrender was simple. How could an intelligent man refuse to believe the war ended for 29 years? The answer is that Onoda's training worked exactly as designed. Nakano School had created a soldier immune to propaganda. The problem was that Nakano School defined all information except direct orders from Imperial Army officers as propaganda. This meant Onoda could not believe Japan surrendered because surrender announcements came from sources his training told him to distrust. Leaflets were enemy propaganda. Family members could be coerced or actors. Newspapers could be forged. Only his commanding officer's direct order could override his original orders, and his commanding officer had not come. Therefore, his original orders remained in effect. This was not insanity. This was perfect obedience taken to its logical extreme. Onoda was doing exactly what his training demanded. He was being the perfect soldier. The tragedy was that perfection in following orders meant 29 years of unnecessary fighting. The end of Onoda's war came through a civilian. In February 1974, a Japanese college dropout named Norio Suzuki traveled to Lubang Island. He wanted to find Onoda, not to capture him, not to convince him to surrender, just to meet him. Suzuki walked through the jungle calling Onoda's name. He was not military, and he was not government. He was just a curious traveler. This unusual approach worked. Onoda made contact. For the first time in 29 years, Onoda spoke with someone from Japan who was not trying to convince him the war was over. Suzuki asked Onoda what it would take for him to surrender. Onoda said he would surrender only if his commanding officer ordered him to. Suzuki returned to Japan. He found Major Yoshimi Taniguchi. Taniguchi was now 74 years old. He had been living a quiet life in Japan. He had assumed Onoda was dead. Suzuki explained the situation. Taniguchi agreed to go to Lubang. On March 9, 1974, Major Taniguchi arrived on Lubang Island. He wore his old Imperial Army uniform. He carried papers proving his identity. He met Onoda in a pre-arranged location. Onoda saluted, and Taniguchi returned the salute. Taniguchi then read the orders relieving Onoda of duty. Onoda listened. He had been waiting 29 years for these orders. When Taniguchi finished, Onoda asked if the orders were authentic. Taniguchi confirmed they were. Onoda asked about the status of the war. Taniguchi explained that Japan had surrendered in 1945. Japan was now peaceful and prosperous. Onoda asked why no one had come to retrieve him earlier. Taniguchi explained that everyone had assumed he was dead. Onoda accepted this explanation. He formally surrendered his rifle, his sword, his ammunition, and his hand grenades. Some of the grenades were still functional after 29 years in jungle humidity. Onoda had maintained his equipment perfectly. He had been ready to fight until the moment his orders changed. The moral complexity of Onoda's story cannot be avoided. Philippine families lost loved ones to Onoda's attacks years after the war ended. From the Philippine perspective, Onoda was a murderer. President Ferdinand Marcos pardoned him, saying Onoda was following military orders and believed he was at war. The decision was controversial. Families of victims felt that justice was denied. Marcos calculated that prosecuting Onoda would damage relations with Japan because Japan provided economic aid. A war crimes trial would have complicated that relationship. In the end, Onoda was allowed to return to Japan. Onoda's return to Japan was complicated. He was celebrated as a symbol of loyalty. He had followed orders for 29 years. From the military perspective, he was the perfect soldier. But Onoda felt uncomfortable with the celebration, and he said he had only done his duty. He struggled to adapt to modern Japan. The country was completely different. Japan in 1974 was wealthy, peaceful, and democratic, and Onoda found it unfamiliar. He felt disconnected. In 1975, he moved to Brazil and became a cattle rancher. He lived quietly, occasionally giving interviews. He always emphasized that he had simply followed orders. He expressed regret for Philippine civilians killed, but he maintained he had believed he was fighting enemy forces at the time. A comparison with other Japanese holdouts tells Onoda's story in context. Approximately 127 Japanese soldiers held out after the war. Most surrendered within a few years. Shoichi Yokoi held out in Guam until 1972. Teruo Nakamura held out in Indonesia until 1974. But Onoda held out longest while actively fighting. Other holdouts hid and avoided contact. Onoda fought. He killed. The difference was Onoda's Nakano School training and specific orders. His training gave him tools to resist persuasion. His orders gave him a clear condition for surrender. Only his commanding officer's direct order would suffice. Everything else was enemy deception. This made him simultaneously the most effective holdout and the most tragic. Hiroo Onoda died on January 16, 2014, at age 91. He lived 40 years after surrendering, ranching, and giving speeches about his experience. He returned to Lubang Island to fund scholarships for local children. Some saw this as atonement. Others saw it as inadequate. His death prompted renewed debate. Was he a hero or a killer? Was he a symbol of loyalty or blind obedience? The answer depends on perspective. From a military perspective, Onoda followed orders absolutely. From a moral perspective, he demonstrated the danger of obedience without judgment. He killed civilians for 29 years because his orders did not include provisions for surrender except under specific conditions. Those conditions took 29 years to occur. The soldier who refused to surrender for 29 years after the war ended proved that loyalty and obedience can become pathological. Onoda was trained to ignore all information except orders from his chain of command. He did exactly that for 3 decades. The result was unnecessary killing, wasted years, and permanent moral ambiguity. Onoda believed he was being a good soldier. The Philippines believed he was a murderer. Japan believed he was a symbol of dedication. All 3 perspectives contained truth. That was Japanese military training. That was absolute obedience. That was Hiroo Onoda. The war ended in 1945. He fought until 1974. Not because he did not know, because he could not accept any truth except the one his commanding officer told him.